All right, bit of a different one. Lewis couldn't make it today because Lewis has a baby to deal with at this time of the day we're recording, but that's okay. We'll just press on without him. I'm recording my end of Irrational Fear on Dharawal land. Let's start the show.
The following program contains rude words like Mark Latham, blockchain, and Twitter. Irrational Fear recommends listening by immature audiences. Comedians, experts, laughing at the world as it burns down around us. This is a Rational Fear.
Tonight, the number one honest fake news website, The Onion, buys the number one real fake news, The InfoWars, prompting fears of truthception. And RFK Jr. is named as Health Secretary as the hours of opposite day are extended to opposite 4 years. And COP29 climate conference is underway in Baku in Azerbaijan. Delegates have complained that yet again the climate talks have been held in a petrostate in the middle of nowhere, saying that they should be held in a petrostate closer to home. It's the 16th of November, and with more legislation to shut down an independent candidate, this is Irrational Fear.
This is a Rational Fear.
Don't forget to unplug your set.
Hello, welcome to Irrational Fear. I'm your host, former morning show host of 2GB, Dan Illich, and we are talking COP29 this week on the podcast. COP has been filled so far with juicy gossip. Argentina walked out after President Javier Milei has basically come out as a climate skeptic. The French cancelled their whole trip because the Azerbaijani president decided to make some remarks about France's colonial past. And small island states and developing countries are still walking around the convention halls shaking a bucket saying, "Where the fuck's our money?" Well, joining us are two friends of the show and COP tragics. We've got Richie Merzian and Linh Do. Thanks for joining us live in Baku.
How exciting. Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
That you sounded pretty exasperated, Richie. It doesn't sound that exciting. Maybe it's 10:30 in the morning, or maybe you're just worn out after 4 days of climate negotiations.
It's day 4 and we're already tired.
We've already had 2 hours of meetings, so we're good to go.
Well, this is it. This is a long haul. Every COP is a big long haul, multi-day affair, moving commas, deciding what a definition of anything is, trying to come to a global agreement. What are the goals for this COP29?
This one is all about the money. This is the big, shiny financial commitment that's going to be put on the table. This is about the cash. 15 years ago, countries agreed on $100 billion to be provided annually. And that was both from developed countries, but also from investment outfits and private sector. Now it's time to update that.
And what are people asking for? Are they asking for more? Are they asking for it to be paid at all?
Yeah, we've hit that 100 billion mark, which was by 2020, and now we're in 2024. And so post 2025, what's that going to be? Now we're looking at more like $1 trillion. But the question is, which countries should cough up, and what does that money actually look like? Is it just a direct grant from a developed country to a developing? Is it more the blended finance that different outfits, World Bank and that kind of thing can provide? So what does this all look like? Some have compared it to an onion with all different layers. It certainly left a few people crying.
I think what's maybe worth adding to that as well is that finance, of course, of that numbers are like totally eye-watering to the average person, but really has big implications for governments in how they can spend it, what that means for their ongoing obligations. Is it like money to implement something? Is it a grant at zero interest? What does that mean? The Australian government just like gave some money to the Asian Development Bank, for example, and will likely count that as part of their climate finance obligations. But that comes with a whole set of strings that like recipient countries probably won't want. And so there's just like some, I think in addition to like funny accounting, just like funny ways of structuring these contracts and like creating loopholes that in part this COP is also trying to like define and narrow.
It sounds like you need a COP to get rid of all the loopholes. It sounds like there's work to be done to get rid of any kind of ways of getting out of paying for this finance.
This is the issue. Like everything is strung together, Dan. Like this is sort of a peer pressure driven process. And so unless you're willing to kind of work with your peers and step up, then you can easily find ways to wiggle out.
There has been some pretty big announcements out of COP29 so far. I noticed that the UK have changed their NDC to be a bit more aggressive. Is that right, Linh?
Yes, that is correct. I think as one former very senior official said, today's the first day I can say I'm proud of my country and government as a climate advocate. And I think that's sort of in part what these COPs have, to a degree, become about, is people using it as an opportunity to make an announcement that otherwise might not be celebrated, to try to gain that sort of like domestic buy-in as well.
Is it kind of strange though, like, Trump gets in and then the UK steps up and is like, right, we're in charge now. We're gonna kick down the door. We're gonna kick down the door. We're gonna make it a more aggressive, nationally determined contribution. Do you think Trump getting in had anything to do with it?
They've probably been working on this for like months. So I don't want to like discount all of the work that's been going on behind the scenes to get the NDC to where it is, like civil society, public servants, all of those bits and pieces. But I think like the timing of the announcement, how hard they went on it as well, definitely is just part of that hello world order. We're not letting everything collapse just because one country is pulling out. For better or for worse, Richie, you might remember when the last COP, just for context, when Trump won the last time in 2016, was when the Morocco UN climate talks were happening. And I think no one was prepared for that at all. And there was this like mass scramble. And I think like the smallest of silver linings for Trump winning this most recent election was people going, wait, we know how to respond. It's okay. We're not actually that dependent on the US singularly.
Richie, is that right? Are a lot of countries going, fuck it, the US, we're just going to move on?
Yeah, it's surprisingly like absent from the conversations here. Like It was a big deal the first day or two. And now everyone has kind of like said, okay, now we're going to get back to doing the actual work. The good thing is Trump, while significant, is not the trend. And the economics, I'm here with the Clean Energy Investor Group. It's a bunch of renewable investors and developers. They're backing this because it's directly in their interest. They're going to make bank on it. Most other countries are moving to tripling their renewable energy this year. Why? One, it's climate. But second, it's just going to bring them cheaper energy. And so everyone's kind of getting on with the game. Same thing with national targets. That's what's going to drive the investment as well. And the finance pledge, that's all about basically showing developing countries, if you be ambitious, the money will be there.
This isn't the Joe Rogan podcast, so we don't normally talk about the N-word, but nuclear. Has there been much talk about nuclear this COP29?
Not really, no. I mean, to be honest, there's not that much talk about nuclear at most COPs. There's a little pavilion, the Atoms for Nuclear. What is it? Atoms for Climate, I think it's called.
Yes, exactly.
And they pay a bunch of people to wear blue shirts with the sort of the nuclear circles all circling around. And maybe they hand out gummy bears to some point around what that means, nuclear waste.
Hopefully they're like little green and yellow gummy bears. That would be great. Like they would like
That's
nuclear.
Right. And little yellow cakes along with it, yeah.
Yellow cupcakes would be great to hand out at the nuclear pavilion.
I think what's like for me really promising is it's not here in the negotiations because people are serious about actually trying to like implement some climate action. That's my again, hopeful side. But I've been to a couple of events outside of Baku. So, at any COP, there's always things happening on the fringe. I mean, in the way that nuclear is a really fringe climate solution, I did go to an event where some major companies, which I will not name, were talking about how they were using power purchasing agreements, which historically have been used for renewable energy, to buy nuclear reactors in the US with the hope that they can now do that in other countries. So I think inside the negotiations, very little talk of nukes other than, what Richie already indicated. But on the outside, as a fringe issue, there's always going to be a loud person.
All right. Well, what is the vibe on the ground there? What is, how is Azerbaijan treating delegates this year? Does it feel good to be there?
Last year, I described COP as being like Burning Man. This year, I describe it a little bit like Boxing Day sales. And it's been a while since I've been to a shopping mall on Boxing Day, but it's elbows out. Even though this COP is technically like smaller in terms of delegate numbers and whatever else, the venue size makes it feel like it's bursting up the seams. And as a result, I think people are feeling a diminished hospitality. There's only so much hospitality that can be shared around. And that's made it particularly interesting to sort of be here. You might have also seen a whale got beached by the Caspian Sea in Baku on the very first day.
Oh my God, what an omen. Oh, a beached whale.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So I don't want to foreshadow like how I feel about the 2 weeks, but I feel like the whale right now.
Oh my God.
A little bit stuck, a little bit uncertain of what's to come.
Incidentally, it's 50 years ago this month when that clip from the internet that went viral where they blew up the whale with TNT. Do you guys remember that clip? Very famous clip.
Yeah, I remember that clip. That was wild.
That was filmed 50 years ago. And
wow.
It's so funny that that's happened and then a beached whale at COP has happened too.
There's just some momentum to, I guess, like last year was a big deal. The UAE consensus, for the first time, we named the F word in terms of fossil fuels and weeding them out of our energy system. today's energy day, so there's a lot on the agenda, including like the need to triple renewable storage. Australia's got a great story to tell on that. I think they just hit the record for like 1 in 3 homes now have rooftop solar in Australia. 75% penetration at one point. So 3/4 of our grid was running on green energy. So Australia's got a really good story to tell. And I think even Premier Malinowskis is coming out next week to spruik Adelaide as a potential host city in 2 years.
Where do you think COP31 might happen, Richie? Like, what are the kind of the cities on the cards, do you think?
So Adelaide and South Australia have been the loudest and proudest in terms of bidding for it, and good job. Like, they've got a great story to tell in terms of the really high level of renewables and what the transition looks like. Plus, they're really gearing into clean energy exports and what they can do with hydrogen and steel and everything. So good on them. But my money's probably on Sydney. I think really just because it's got the size, it's got the profile. It's where the PM and the energy minister are based when they're not in Canberra. And you've got a Labor government that's probably going to work alongside a federal Labor government to put it on. Yeah. Brisbane, unlikely now because you've got a change in government and probably less appetite. And Melbourne, after it struggled with the Commonwealth Games, it's also got a state election on at the same time. So it's looking unlikely to go down to the southern capital.
Are we thinking that the government might make a move on COP after the election here, whether they get in or not? Like if the coalition get in, obviously COP31 would be off the cards, right?
Oh, maybe. Firstly, it'd be great if COP31 is actually announced here in Baku. It might not happen. It might get kicked down the road. President Erdogan was here from Turkey saying Turkey's still keen. Right. That's a competing bid against Australia's. And if they can't get consensus here, then it gets kicked down to next year. So it might just still be in bid form, in which case, who knows what happens to it. But if it does get locked in, the coalition does have a record of actually seeing through international commitments Australia takes on. They did the same thing with the G20. We all remember when Prime Minister Abbott rocked up to the G20 and started complaining about how he wanted to jack up the Medicare fees. So they'll still see it through, but just maybe not with the same polish.
It's kind of weird, isn't it? We have got a great story to tell when it comes to climate in terms of energy, renewables, storage, kind of moving in agriculture. Transport's kind of on the way, not quite there yet. But we've got some pretty good stories to tell. Aside from our Scope 3 emissions, we've got some good stories to tell.
I think one of the other really good stories that we have to tell is all of the First Nations communities who have really been protecting, defending and stewarding land as well. And maybe one of the things that's probably really different about being on the ground in Baku right now is the number of First Nations Australians who have chosen to come up to this international community and share these stories about the progress of what communities have been doing in addition to all of the clean energy transitions that we're seeing in Australia too, which I think is also very positive. And it's interesting that that's a story that really resonates internationally, but not necessarily back home.
Well, I've got some questions from our Patreon supporters. I'd love it if you could give us your best answer off the top of your head. This one comes from Tim. Do you think the USA pulling out of all climate accords will encourage other countries to do so, or will they just be stricter like the EU?
No one really pulled out after the US last time. So I think precedent says that highly unlikely. And given the reasons why they're pulling out and some of the other things that sort of Trump normalizes, most governments are pretty keen to defend what exists of democracy.
Just to add to that, Dan, the COP is all about trying to attract investment to actually transition your energy, transition your economy, and to basically build these net zero industries. And so if the US is dealing itself out, a whole bunch of countries have told me, great, that just means more opportunity for us. And that's the reality now.
And that also seems like a great opportunity for us too. Like if the US does deal themselves out, particularly the IRA, we could be building electric automobiles in Australia. It seems to be like an easy place to kind of restart industry.
Maybe even in Adelaide.
This question comes from the New Blurt podcast. Do we basically ignore the failed states as much as we can and get on with saving our planet? I'm not too sure what they mean by this. I don't know who the failed states are, but let's move that one. Let's move that one aside. We'll put a pin on that one. This one comes from Dim Simple. Is there any point to COPs anymore, given that it's overwhelmingly obvious that not only most Western powers are going to extract and burn every last bit of fossil fuels they can to turn a profit, they're also going to go to war over the last remaining bits that they don't already control. Is there any point into continuing this charade?
Yeah, it's the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Richie and I were just hit with a real moment of sadness. Are we at a charade right now? Oh, okay.
Yep.
What do you
Well,
think,
I mean,
Richie?
you two are great to come
Yeah.
on. You two are great to come on this show because you've been to so many COPs. Lynn and I think we met at a COP. Like when you were at a COP, Lynn, you were a youth delegate, and now look at you. You're very much working your way to the middle-aged delegate.
Still a spring chicken, thank you. Yeah.
Still confused for 15.
They call me an elder, thanks.
So I'm happy to jump in. Look, the COPs are the best process that we have to actually solve the climate crisis. That's the reality. It's consensus-based because every country wants to have a say and every country wants to be part of the solution, right? And the fact that you still get consensus at the end of each conference, the fact that you had 195 countries agree to every word in the Paris Agreement to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees is huge. We can't even agree on a climate plan in Australia, and we just need a simple 51% majority. And the entire world has agreed on a roadmap to get to net zero. So it's a huge achievement. But if you look at any single one event, sure, you can punch holes in it. You can talk, write it off as a talk fest, and you can rip into the COP president. Like all those things are a reality for sure. But at the same time, people keep coming back because this is the space where you have your say and you join the consensus. And alongside that, businesses, youth activists, everyone else is coming because this is the space to actually work collectively, especially when your country decides to flake out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what's really reassuring and different about the COPs over the years is once upon a time, it was just on what was that consensus that could be achieved, which has like really progressed a whole bunch of commitments that we wouldn't otherwise have. But now it's also about like what businesses can be here to launch renewable energy projects, what alliances could be formed to reduce like emissions in like the whole space, which is one of the outcomes from this COP alongside what's been happening in like sort of buildings and like the built environment sector as well. So there's always a lot happening. And I guess part of these events becoming so big is every good news story. There's probably like, a bad news story here and there. And people just love talking about the negative and that's what sells, right?
When is the final text due for this conference and what will be in it, do you think?
It sort of depends on the presidency. So like in terms of like how that happens, normally the final text is the main squabble, for want of a better word, in the last 2 days. And many of the negotiations at the moment are around thinking through and talking through what gets included, what doesn't. I think one of the things that is not surprising but a bit disappointing is some of the moves to regress on things that have been agreed to, like last year in Dubai and like previous COPs as well. So unfortunately, a fair amount of work has to be done on that front. Richie, what do you want to add?
Just that Australia's got a really interesting role to play here. So the final text comes together in the final couple of days. It's a package deal. So nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. And so there's lots of horse trading, different issues, different work streams. But Australia's got a really interesting role because Minister Bowen, our climate and energy minister, is going to arrive on the weekend and then take over the main negotiations on finance along with his Egyptian ministerial counterpart. And they're going to be responsible that final week of actually bringing every country together and actually getting them to compromise and to chip away until you can land that final text, which then they can hand to the presidency to gavel in. That's a role Australia played in 2016, right after Copenhagen in Cancun, to save the climate negotiations. Australia was instrumental in agreeing on that original $100 billion goal 15 years ago. It was also instrumental in pushing a lot of the climate finance through the Green Climate Fund, the big financing instrument that the UN created as well. So Australia's got a really powerful track record here. And if Australia can show that it can step up and actually take this leadership role, I think it puts it in a really strong position for actually taking on the entire conference in 2 years' time. So it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out.
So this is like a bit of an audition for Chris Bowen, these final couple of days.
Yes.
Wow, amazing.
Sure is.
Yep, audition, practice run, all of those things.
But with serious consequences, with billion-dollar consequences.
Yeah, right. I've always said COP is a bit like the Logies for climate change. Have you seen any climate celebrities in your travels this week?
Well, I saw Richie, so I don't want to say I've seen one of the biggest climate celebrities out there, but definitely so. I mean, I guess for humble brag, later tonight I'm going to an event with Al Gore.
Oh,
so
excuse me.
Well,
Well, come on. I don't think you're allowed to say your former boss as a climate celebrity.
Oh, okay. That's fair. That's fair. I'll name some other people. Actually, last night, Richie and I were at an event where Malcolm Turnbull was there, Andrew Forrest was there, talking about all of the possible benefits that come from Australia hosting COP31 for, really being able to push for some of the things that we haven't been able to do domestically without that international pressure. But actually, in all seriousness, I have seen far fewer celebs here, but I did get an invite to something with Theo James. I wouldn't say he's a climate celebrity. I think he's just a celebrity. And I'm not entirely sure what that was about.
You didn't see Ronaldinho from the Brazilian soccer team the Brazilians have brought out here, walking around looking slightly confused?
No, there you go. I've been at the wrong end of the Boxing Day sales.
Well, thank you both for bringing your elbows pointed out to this podcast. It's always great to have you on. And speaking of Brazil, Brazil's holding the next COP, COP30. Is that a tentpole COP? Would you say is that a big one that people should be keeping their eyes on?
Yeah, it should be. I mean, it's going to be literally a tentpole COP in the sense that they're holding it in the Amazon.
Right.
We'll have to bring out seriously large circus tents to host. Because I think there's 4 hotels in that city of Belém. So that will be a really curious one because it's also an important one. That's when all the targets for 2035 are due. Countries are supposed to submit them by February. We're hoping the Australian government does that. That level of ambition needs to add up to keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. If it doesn't, then that will be a huge argy-bargy in Brazil to try and ramp up that ambition. And if that doesn't happen, then all the more reason for Australia and the Pacific to host the next year and bring it home.
Well, hopefully Australia does ramp up its NDC, so it is in good stead to hold COP31 with the Pacific in a few years' time.
And Matt Keane has been around as well as the Climate Change Authority chair, basically, testing the waters and gathering up what he needs in order to put forward, a pretty strong case on Australia. So
friend of the podcast, Matt Keane, been on a couple of times.
There you go.
All right, big thank you to Richie and Linh. Thank you so much for joining us from Baku. What's the best meal you've had in Baku so far?
We just ate some cheese puffs. I want to say that probably the cuisine of Azerbaijan is better than what we're being served in the conference centre. But I had some fries the other day. That's a hard one. Best meal. I hear the food here is meant to be nice. The food inside the conference centre, we are in a football stadium. So I guess imagine what you'd get at a football stadium.
Yeah, right. Richie?
There's been caviar on the menu. The temptation is there. Maybe just not the financial support. So if we can fundraise more, then we
Sounds
can
like
get
you
there.
need some of that loss and damages money to pay for that caviar. Big thank you to Road Mics and our Patreon supporters, Jacob Round on the Teppanyaki timeline. Until next week, there's always something to be scared of, and I'm recording my end of Irrational Fear on Gundungurra and Thurrow land. Goodbye.